Monday, 21st September 1942. Dearest Kitty, I'll tell you the general news here in the annex. A lamp has been mounted above my divan bed so that in future when I hear the guns going off, I'll be able to pull a cord and switch on the light. I can't use it at the moment because we're keeping our window open a little, day and night. The male members of the Van Daan contingent have built a very handy wood-stained food safe with real screens. Up till now, this glorious cupboard has been located in Peter's room, but in the interests of fresh air, it's been moved to the attic. Where it once stood, there is now a shelf. I advised Peter to put his table underneath the shelf, add a nice rug, and hang his own cupboard where the table now stands. That might make his cubbyhole a little more comfy, though I certainly wouldn't like to sleep there. Mrs. Van Daan is unbearable. I'm continually being scolded for my incessant chatter when I'm upstairs. I simply let the words bounce right off me. Madame now has a new trick up her sleeve, trying to get out the washing the pots and pans. If there's a bit of food left at the bottom of the pan, she leaves it to spoil instead of transferring it to a glass dish. Then, in the afternoon, when Margot is stuck with cleaning all the pots and pans, Madame explains, "Oh, poor Margot, you have so much work to do." Every other week, Mr. Clement brings me a couple of books written for girls my age. I'm enthusiastic about Duc de Heul series. I've enjoyed all of Sissy van Marksveldt's books very much. I've read The Zaniest Summer 4 times, and the ludicrous situations still make me laugh. Father and I are currently working on our family tree, and he tells me something about each person as we go along. I've begun my schoolwork. I'm working hard at French, cramming 5 irregular verbs into my head every day, but I've forgotten much too much of what I learned in school. Peter has taken up his English with great reluctance. A few school books have just arrived, and I brought a large supply of exercise books, pencils, rubbers and labels from home. Pim, that's our pet name for Father, wants me to help him with Dutch lessons. I'm perfectly willing to teach him in exchange for his assistance with French and other subjects, but he makes the most unbelievable mistakes. I sometimes listen to the Dutch broadcasts from London. Prince Bernhard is recently pronounced that Princess Juliana is expecting a baby in January, which I think is wonderful. No one here understands why I take such an interest in the royal family. A few nights ago, I was the topic of discussion, and we all decided I was an ignoramus. As a result, I threw myself into my schoolwork the next day, since I have little desire to be in the first form when I'm 14 or 15. The fact that I'm hardly allowed to read anything was also discussed. At the moment, Mother's reading The House of Tavelink, and of course, I'm not allowed to read it, though Margot is. First, I have to be more intellectually developed, like my genius of a sister. Then we discuss my ignorance of philosophy, psychology, and physiology. I immediately looked up these big words in the dictionary. It's true, I don't know anything about these subjects, but maybe I'll have learned more by next year. I've come to the shocking conclusion that I have only 1 long-sleeve dress and 3 cardigans to wear in the winter. Father's given me permission to knit a white jumper. The wool isn't very pretty, but it'll be warm and that's what counts. Some of our clothing was left with friends, but unfortunately we won't be able to get to it until after the war. Provided it's still there, of course. I'd just finished writing about Mrs. Van Daan when she walked into the room. Thump. I slammed the book shut. "Hey, Anne, can't I even take a peek?" "No, Mrs. Van Daan." "Just the last page, then." "No, not even the last page, Mrs. Van Daan." Of course, I nearly died, since that particular page contained a rather unflattering description of her. There's something happening every day, but I'm too tired and too lazy to write it all down. Yours, Anne. Friday, 25th of September, 1942. Dearest Kitty, Father has a friend, a man in his mid-70s named Mr. Dreyer, who's sick, poor and deaf as a post. At his side, like a useless appendage, is his wife, 27 years younger and equally poor, whose arms and legs are loaded with real and fake bracelets and rings left over from more prosperous days. This Mr. Dreyer has always been a great nuisance to Father, and I've always admired the saintly patience with which he handled this pathetic old man on the phone. When we were still living at home, Mother used to advise him to put a gramophone in front of the receiver, one that would repeat every 3 minutes, "Yes, Mr. Dreyer," and "No, Mr. Dreyer," since the old man never understood a word of Father's lengthy replies anyway. Today, Mr. Dreyer phoned the office and asked Mr. Kugler to come and see him. Mr. Kugler wasn't in the mood and said that he would send Miep, but Miep cancelled the appointment. Mrs. Dreyer called the office 3 times, but since Miep was reportedly out the entire afternoon, she had to imitate Bep's voice. Downstairs in the office, as well as upstairs in the annex, there was great hilarity. Now each time the phone rings, Bep says, "That's Mrs. Dreyer," and Miep has to laugh, so that the people on the other end of the line are greeted with an impolite giggle. Can't you just picture it? This has got to be the greatest office in the whole wide world. The bosses and the office girls have such fun together. Some evenings I go to the Van Daans for a little chat. We eat mothball biscuits. biscuits that were stored in a wardrobe that was moth-proofed, and have a good time. Recently, the conversation was about Peter. I said that he often pats me on the cheek, which I don't like. They asked me, in a typically grown-up way, whether I could ever learn to love Peter like a brother, since he loves me like a sister. Oh, no, I said, but what I was thinking was, just imagine. I added that Peter's a bit stiff because he's so shy. Boys who aren't used to being around girls are like that. I must say that the Annex Committee, the men's section, is very creative. Listen to this scheme that they've come up with to get a message to Mr. Brox, an Opecta company sales representative and friend who's surreptitiously hidden some of our things for us. They're going to type a letter to one shop owner in southern Zealand who is indirectly one of Opecta's customers and ask him to fill out a form and send it back in the enclosed self-addressed envelope. Father will write the address on the envelope himself. Once the letter is returned from Zealand, the form can be removed and a handwritten message confirming that Father is alive can be inserted in the envelope. This way, Mr. Brox can read the letter without suspecting a ruse. They chose the province of Zealand because it's close to Belgium, a letter can be easily smuggled across the border, and because no one is allowed to travel there without a special permit. An ordinary salesman like Mr. Brox would never be granted a permit. Yesterday, Father put on another act. Groggy with sleep, he stumbled off to bed. His feet were cold, so I lent him my bed socks. 5 minutes later, he flung them to the floor. Then he pulled the blankets over his head because the light bothered him. The lamp was switched off, and he gingerly poked his head out from under the covers. It was all very amusing. We started talking about the fact that Peter says Margot is a busy bee. Suddenly, Daddy's voice was heard from the depths. A busybody, you mean? Mushi, the cat, is becoming nicer to me as time goes by, but I'm still somewhat afraid of her. Yours, Anne. Sunday, 27th September 1942. Dearest Kitty, Mother and I had a so-called discussion today, but the annoying part is that I burst into tears. I can't help it. Daddy is always so nice to me, but he also understands me much better. At moments like these, I can't stand Mother. It's obvious that I'm a stranger to her. She doesn't even know what I would think about the most ordinary things. We were talking about maids and the fact that you're supposed to refer to them as domestic help these days. She claimed that when the war was over, that's what they'll want to be called. I didn't quite see it that way. Then she added that I talk about later so often and that I act as if I was such a lady, even though I'm not. But I don't think building sandcastles in the air is such a terrible thing to do, as long as you don't take it too seriously. At any rate, Daddy usually comes to my defence. Without him, I wouldn't be able to stick it out here. I don't get along with Margot very well either. Even though our family has never had the same kind of outburst as upstairs, I find it far from pleasant. Margot's and Mother's personalities are so alien to me. I understand my girlfriends better than my own mother. Isn't that a shame? For the umpteenth time, Mrs. Van Daan is sulking. She's very moody and has been removing more and more of her belongings and locking them up. It's too bad Mother doesn't repay every Van Daan disappearing act with a Frank disappearing act. Some people, like the Van Daans, seem to take special delight not only in raising their own children, but in helping raise others. Margot doesn't need it since she's naturally good, kind and clever, perfection itself, but I seem to have enough mischief for the two of us. More than once the air has been filled with the Van Daans' admonitions and my cheeky replies. Father and Mother always defend me fiercely. Without them, I wouldn't be able to jump back into the fray with my usual composure. They keep telling me I should talk less, mind my own business and be more modest, but I seem doomed to failure. If Father weren't so patient, I'd have long ago given up hope of ever meeting my parents' quite moderate expectations. If I take a small helping of a vegetable I loathe and eat potatoes instead, the Van Daans, especially Mrs. Van Daan, can't get over how spoiled I am. Come on, Anne, eat some more vegetables, she says. No, thank you, Ma'am, I reply. The potatoes are more than enough. Vegetables are good for you. Your mother says so too. Have some more, she insists, until Father intervenes and upholds my right to refuse a dish I don't like. Then Mrs. Van Daan really flies off the handle. You should have been at our house where children were brought up the way they should be. I don't call this a proper upbringing. Anne is terribly spoiled. I'd never allow that. If Anne were my daughter... This is how her tirades begin and end. If Anne were my daughter, thank goodness I'm not. But to get back to the subject of raising children, yesterday a silence fell after Mrs. Van D finished her little speech. Father then replied, I think Anne is very well brought up. At least she's learned not to respond to your interminable sermons. As far as the vegetables are concerned, all I have to say is look who's calling the kettle black. Mrs. Van D was soundly defeated. The pot calling the kettle black refers, of course, to Madam herself, since she can't tolerate beans or any kind of cabbage in the evening because they give her wind. But I could say the same. What a twit, don't you think? In any case, let's hope she stops talking about me. It's so funny to see how quickly Mrs. Van Dam flushes. I don't, and it secretly annoys her no end. Yours, Anne.